Matthew 9:18-34. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, If I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, Go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. And as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying aloud, Have mercy on us, Son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, Do you believe that I am able to do this? And they said to him, Yes, Lord. And he touched their eyes, saying, According to your faith be it done to you. And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, See that no one knows about it. But they went away and spread his fame through all that district. As they were going away, behold, a demon-oppressed man who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds marveled, saying, Never was anything like this seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, He casts out demons by the prince of demons. The word of the Lord.
Let's pray. Well, Jesus, we just ask that you would help us to be still and see that you are God and to receive from your word, not just who you are, but what you have done. And so, Lord, be with us, speak to us. Holy Spirit, be massaging the word in our hearts. Help us to see Jesus in ways that we need to see him. In your name I pray. Amen. So I think one of the things I've noticed as I've been reading the Gospels, I've been going through the Bible in a year, and when I talk about the Gospels, I'm talking about the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you see some of this in John as well. But one of the things I've noticed is that all the Gospel writers, all that they're trying to do is really show you who Jesus is. I mean, that's one of the things they're really focusing on. And it's because, like, if you see who Jesus is clearly, it's only then that you will change how you live and even how you relate to him. Only if you see him clearly. And so, who Jesus is and what he has done, that's the motivation, that's the power for following him. That's where all that the oomph for following Jesus comes from. And so the gospel, when you think about it, is really about who Jesus is and what he has done. And the reason why I start off like this is because I think this is so important for you and I to remember and actually to continue to hear over and over again. This can never and should never be old to us. And it's because you are either in a place where you are disconnect with your relationship with God, discontent, or you know someone who is disconnect in their relationship with God, or you just might have a serious case of spiritual amnesia. And I think that goes on a continuum. What I mean by spiritual amnesia is that we just forget what God has done for us. We forget the gospel and so easily turn off into trying to fix things ourselves. And so in today's passage, there are actually 3 stories where you see that how people see Jesus is what leads to how they relate to them. How people see Jesus is what leads to maybe a change, a transformation in their life, right? He fixes it. In every one of these stories, he fixes it. And when people see Jesus clearly, that's when they run to him. And so there are 3 themes in these stories that show this reality. And what I want to do is I want to look at these themes. And so here they are. First theme is the faith. Second theme is the touch. And the last theme is the talk. And what I want to do is I want to look at each one of these and just see how it changes how we view Jesus. And so let's talk about the faith. So at this point of where we are in Matthew, we're at the end of Matthew's chapters 8 through 9. And at this point, word about Jesus has been getting around. And you know that because now at this point, people are interrupting Jesus. If you remember last week, Jesus just got done talking to the Pharisees and John's disciples, and it says that Jesus essentially gets interrupted, right? People are coming to him, interrupting what he's doing, right? So right here, a ruler of the synagogue, in verse 18, it's most likely who this guy is. He's most likely a ruler of the synagogue, and he comes to Jesus in verse 18, in the middle of Jesus talking, and he just comes and asks if Jesus would come raise his daughter. No big deal, right? Anybody could do that, right? But look at verse 18, it says this: while he was saying these things, as in while he was teaching the Pharisees and John's disciples, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And then it says Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And so look, while Jesus is on the way, he leaves with his disciples, and while he's on the way to go heal this man's daughter, here a lady who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years comes to him in verse 20, right? And then not long after that, in the middle of that, blind men are crying out to Jesus, would you come heal us? And they say that in verse 27. And then pretty soon after that, in verse 32, Jesus is asked to heal a demon-possessed man who's been mute by this demon possession by his friends. And so you get this sense that, man, word is really spreading around about Jesus. Like over and over again, people are flocking to Jesus. And really what this does, this just sets the stage for this theme that we're going to see about faith. Faith is the constant theme, and I think just as a pro tip for when you're reading the Bible, anytime you see a word repeated, it means that you should pay attention to it, right? Because it's something that the author is going to focus on, and this is what Matthew is focusing on here. Faith is repeated twice, once in each of the stories. And it's assumed in the demon-possessed man's story. So again, just a little quick thing about Matthew. He has a habit of telling short stories. He kind of gets lazy, it seems like. Whenever he's in context of saying something, if you see a pattern in Matthew, assume that that's happening even if he doesn't say it, right? And so here you have faith being mentioned here in two stories, and the idea here is the same thing for this demon-possessed man. So let's look at verse 22 and then 29. It says this, showing you just this theme of faith. Verse 22, Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter. That's crazy. Isn't that cool to hear the voice of the Father through Jesus? Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And instantly, she was made well. We'll get to that in a second. Verse 28, when he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, do you believe that I'm able to do this? And they said to him, yes, Lord. And then he touched her eyes, saying, according to your faith, there it is again, be it done to you. So when Matthew is using faith here, he's not primarily talking about the faith that makes you acceptable to God. See, that's like saving faith or salvation faith, faith that justifies you, as Romans says, and we'll show you that later. But he's actually using faith to show you that the reason why people are coming, right? The reason why they're flocking to him is because they really believe all the things that have been said about Jesus. That what has been said about Jesus is able to do the things that he's about to do for them now, and so they believe. It's a practical faith. It's kind of like this. It's like when you go to sleep at night, right? You lay on your bed, or maybe you jump on your bed, just like you might see up here, right? And you just totally believe that once you land on your bed, or once you're laying down, like, there's no doubt in your mind that it's going to hold you. Like, do you notice that? When you lay on bed, you don't even think about if it's going to hold you up. You just lay there, right? You don't even think about it. And here, that's the kind of faith that Jesus is talking about here. Every one of the people in these stories, they 100% believe that Jesus is able to do this. And not only is he able to do it, but he will do it. He will execute perfectly. And so the ruler of the synagogue, he believes that Jesus can reverse death. I mean, just think about that. Don't even think about just raising the dead. He reverses it. And so he tells Jesus, my daughter has died, but come, and you can kind of even see if you come and lay your hand on her, she'll live. Verse 21, and I won't read these, but the woman thinks that if she can just get close enough, Jesus will heal her. Verse 28, the blind men, they believe that Jesus is able. He even asked them, do you believe that I can do this? And they're like, yes. And they even acknowledge him as Lord. They see him for who he is. Verse 32, the demon-possessed men, they have friends that believe that Jesus can do this, that they bring him to Jesus even when he can't go himself. And so now what I want you to do is I want you to focus on the bleeding woman here, just for a second. Because this is where the theme of faith develops. she has a slight misunderstanding about how Jesus works. See, it's not Jesus' clothes that have some kind of connective power to Jesus that makes her well. No, Jesus, no pun intended, he connects the dots for her, actually. He says to her, her faith has made her well. And the idea for her to understand is that it's actually not her faith as in, like, she has a measure of faith or the amount of faith she has. No, it's the object of her faith. It's what she's putting her faith in. And so here, only the power of Jesus can save people. Her faith is in Jesus' power, not in her own faith. And that's the writing theme here. Faith in what Jesus can do, faith in who he is. And so now I want you to notice something that points us to the gospel. In verse 21 through 22, the word well is used twice. Remember? Repetition. The word used for well actually comes from the Greek word used for salvation, sozo. And it's used to mean save or to be delivered. And if you think about it, these people are being delivered from something. And so one of the constant themes from Matthew, throughout Matthew, is that physical healings are really a picture of the physical reality that Matthew readers know. See, sometimes we forget this when we're reading Matthew, but Matthew's readers are actually after Jesus' death on the cross. So they know what Jesus' death will do for people. They know the power it will be for them, right? And so the healings that we see here are things that they've experienced, they've seen. They've seen people's lives not just simply healed, but people's sins forgiven. And so the healings here shows us that our sins really is the true sickness. That's the thing that's killing us. The thing that makes us so sick that we die is sin itself. And Jesus actually hints at that, right? So we looked at this last week, but in Matthew 9, verses 12 through 13, Jesus says this, "But when he heard it, he said, 'Those who are well, they have no need for a physician.'" And that's a good point. Like, someone who's healthy doesn't go to a physician to get better. They just go for a checkup, right? But Jesus is saying, those who are sick. He says, "Go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners." And so what Matthew is doing, what he's pointing out to you, is to what Jesus will do with his death on the cross. See, by his death on the cross, Jesus, he takes sin, the sin that kills you, and he puts it on himself, and he's killed by it for you. And in exchange, he gives you his life. And so the gospel, it tells you not only that what Jesus has done in exchange for you to heal you, but he's constantly, let me step back here. The gospel doesn't just simply tell you what Jesus has done in exchange for you, but it tells you that he can heal you. He's the one who steps in your place, right? The gospel tells you that Jesus does it for you, right? But for us, what we tend to do sometimes is we reverse it. Like, we try to fix it, is what I'm getting at here. We try to fix ourselves by telling ourselves that we can do it, or that we need to do it. There's no one else that can do it. We must do it. Or maybe we're ashamed, like Marty was saying, and so we're ashamed to go to God, and then we say, okay, I want to fix it myself. Or there's guilt maybe. Maybe we feel like, man, I've done something wrong. I've got to do it myself. And sometimes we actually do that for people. That's sometimes the language. And so I would say so often people come to you, they come to us, and they say, hey, I have this problem. And what do you tell them? Sometimes you just say, hey, you should try this. You should try this. As if, hey, let me just give you advice. As if you haven't already gotten enough advice in your life, you should try this. But the gospel tells you something different, right? The gospel hears your problem, it looks at your problem, and it says, I know a healer. It didn't say, hey, you should. It says, he has. He has. And so the gospel doesn't just give you a to-do list, right? The gospel gives you a person. The gospel gives you a person who lays his life down, and he puts his resurrected life in you, and he takes the old you, and he gives you a new you, and that's what you see in these people's stories. If you really stop to think about it, these people, the old them that was experiencing some type of suffering gets transformed, and now there is a new them, a new life they're experiencing. And so if you see Jesus for who he really is, if you see him for really who he is, you will believe that he can do the things that has been said about him for so long. And only then when you see him clearly, only then when you believe that he can do what he says he has done, that's when you'll run to him with reckless abandon as if only he can change you. And so it's only by faith in the gospel, only by faith in what he has done that causes you to run. That's the only thing that's causing these people to run. It's the belief that Jesus really can do what has been said about him. And so there's another theme that really adds to this, and it should adjust really our perspective on Jesus. And that theme is the touch. So how Jesus heals people in these stories should really catch your attention, because it's really about what Jesus has done, right? And it shows you who he is. So touch is really significant in all of these stories, right? The common glue between a woman that is hemorrhaging, the common glue between her and the girl who had just died, or the blind man, is that their sickness, it prevents them from being in either God's presence or either in service to God or even in community. That's the thing they share in the story. And so in verse 20, it says that the woman with a discharge of blood for 12 years, she's gone one after one to a doctor and found nothing, right? And here's her situation. Because of this, she's actually considered ceremonially unclean. And if you want to know a little bit more what that looks like, look at Leviticus 15, verses 25 through 27, right? But what this, in short, means for her is that she's hindered from the presence of God. She's hindered from community. And no one wants to touch her, right? Because if you touch her, you become unclean. The same is true for the ruler's daughter, right? In verse 18 through 19. Anyone who touched this girl because she's dead would be unclean. And then they would have to go through a process for them to be made clean again. And so they would be separated from the people of God, separated from God's presence, simply by touching her. And it's slightly true of the blind man in verse 29. I mean, not being touched part, right? I mean, touching him wouldn't make you unclean, but they were separated from God's presence because they were a hindrance to community. I mean, you know it. Do you have a suffering friend in your life? It's a lot of work to be around him. It kind of brings hindrances to community. And so here's the thing. One touch from these people would make you unclean. Actually, if you think about Jesus' predicament, one touch in a sense would make Jesus unclean, but one touch from Jesus makes them clean, if you notice this. And every one of these healings, some form of contact is actually made with Jesus. So the woman, she touches the fringe of Jesus' garment. That's in verse 20, right? And his garment is kind of like an extension of himself in a sense, right? In verse 25, Jesus takes the ruler's daughter by the hand, and he lifts her up, and she's raised from the dead. In verse 29, Jesus touches the blind man's eyes, and they're healed. And so the only oddball here is the one that we're not talking a lot about, is the one there's not a lot of information about, the demon-possessed men. There's really not a lot of detail on the interactions between Jesus and the demon-possessed men. All you know is that his friends bring him, and he's healed. And so look at verses 32, just so you can see the evidence. It says, as they were going away, behold, a demon-possessed, oppressed man was mute. The idea is that he was mute because he was demon-possessed. It was brought to him, to Jesus. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke. And the crowds marveled, saying, never was anything like this seen in Israel. So again, one touch from these people was supposed to make Jesus unclean, but one touch from Jesus ends up making them clean. And so this is where we're pointing to the gospel, right? Because in the gospel, Jesus makes contact with our sin. And when he makes contact with our sin, he gives us his life, just like you see here. So Jesus, he takes their pain, their suffering from them, and in exchange, he heals them. And he gives them a new life, so to speak. So like after this, they live in a way that they've never thought was possible before. And so on the cross, Jesus takes your pain and suffering on himself so that in exchange, he might give them his life, that they might live a whole new way. And this is where Romans 3 comes in. This is what Romans 3 says. 3:23 through 25, it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and they are justified by his grace as a gift. Pause. Step back. All have sinned, fall short of the glory of God. Meaning that we fall short of God's design. We don't live the way that God planned, created us, intended us to live. We fall short of his glory. We've all sinned. Every single one of us. There's not one of us in this room who hasn't sinned. There's not one person in this world who hasn't sinned. And it says we're justified. Justified meaning and we're declared not guilty in God's presence. And it says how? That's the question. By his grace as a gift. How is that possible? It says this, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. It's through Jesus. Somehow, Jesus has done something that has given us redemption. And it says it in verse 25, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. So propitiation just simply means substitute. Jesus substitutes himself with these people in this story in a very tangible way, steps into their place, makes contact with their sin, and gives them himself, gives them life. Quick story. One time, one of my kids broke something in a house in our old house in South St. Paul, and so I just asked who did it. Because I wanted to be honest. They were just going to kind of let it ride, right? You've done that before, right? You broke something and try to just hide it. And so I was like, hey, listen, if no one's going to tell the truth, I want all of you guys, at this point it was just Soren and Chloe, because Barrett, he could do nothing except for be a vegetable and drink milk. And I said, hey, you guys are going to lay in your bed for a few minutes until someone tells the truth. And immediately one of them steps in and says, I did it. I did it. And they did it. They said it because they didn't want their other sibling to face the consequence of laying in their bed. And so they said, I did it. And here's the thing, they didn't do it. I know they didn't do it. But the beautiful thing about this is that they were willing to step into their sibling's place in order that they would go free and take the punishment for them. They cared so much about their sibling that they wanted to absorb the consequence in order for that person to go free. And that's what Jesus has done for you, essentially in the gospel. He does this for you. He steps into your place. He makes contact with your sin. He bears your suffering so that through him you might have a whole new life. And these stories here, they're foreshadowing this gospel reality, right? Foreshadow because the gospel hasn't happened yet in terms of the timeline here, but it's foreshadowing that this is going to happen. And so Jesus even adds a touch to their situation, because not only does Jesus heal them, but he meets a very tangible need for them. So let's go through the stories again. The woman with the discharge of blood, she tries to hide. You notice that? She's like, hey, if I can just touch the fringe of his blanket, I'll make it. And that's what it says. She says to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well, right? She's like, hey, if I can just get a quick touch, I can escape and be healed. But in verse 22, Jesus turned and he sees her. He sees her. Seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. So in front of everyone, Jesus tells everyone, hey, she has been healed and she has been made well. This is so huge because for her, she's going to have to try to go by herself and try to convince everyone that she no longer has this ailment, right? And the longer that you're sick, the longer that you have an ailment, the longer it is that people think, oh, something's really wrong with you. And the longer that you're sick with something like this, the harder it is to believe that you actually have been healed. And so what's really big for this lady is instead of her having to go through this process of convincing everybody else, Jesus does it for her. And not only does he do it for her, but she's instantly connected back to community. Instantly, she's brought back into the presence of God. Because now, instead of her trying to be her own witness, Jesus is her witness. That's the beauty behind this tangible need. For the girl who is dead, Jesus removes the mourners. Right? Look at verse 23 through 24. It says this, and when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players in the crowd making commotion, he said, go away, for the girl's not dead, but sleeping. And then they laughed because, she's dead. She looks like she's dead. And so the flute players and the crowds, they're actually paid people to be mourners. Right? It's part of the burial process here. Jesus, they're there to just really mourn the fact that she's dead as a part of the process. And so Jesus removes them because in Jesus' view, she's not dead, but she's sleeping. And the view in the New Testament is that when death happens, it's not the final word. Because there is going to be a day when Jesus returns and he's going to resurrect those people who believe in him and they're going to have a new life. Right? So for Jesus, death is not the new world, the last word here, right? And so the extra touch for this girl here is that instead of having mourners, Jesus removes them. And he removes them because he's here, there should be a celebration because she's about to live. There's no need for mourners if you're about to live. There's no need for mourners but celebration if you're about to be resurrected. And so here's the thing. Salvation isn't like it's not a spiritual thing, and we try to separate those two things. There's a physical, there's a spiritual, right? But here Jesus is showing you precursor, there's tangible effects, a tangible experience in your life from salvation. And you don't know the rest of these people's story, but the girl, she'll die. They'll face suffering in some senses, but what happens here is that they get a glimpse. They get a glimpse of the life to come. And so do you in salvation. Actually, not just in salvation, but if you are a believer and you have the Holy Spirit constantly in your life, See, this is what has been called by dead and alive theologians as evidence of grace. And I say dead theologians because they're dead, but we still have their books. So we can just read their stuff. But where there is evidence of grace, of the new life in a Christian, Christ is showing you that his Spirit is like a deposit. A little bit of money has been put in as a guarantee that more is coming. A little bit of life has been put in to show you that more is coming. And throughout the believer's life, more and more life is being worked into a person's life. And so what this tells you is that it's telling you that who Jesus is he's one who starts to work in you but continues it. And he gives you this evidence of grace so that you could trust him continually. And so I think what this says is that the gospel, it's not a dead gospel. It's not a dead gospel, but it's a living one. It's one that continues to breathe the life and transforms people's life continually. And so that also means that Jesus is not a concept, but he's real. He's tangible. He's a person that has come down and laid his life down for you. And I think this paints a picture of the kind of work that Jesus does, right? He starts a work and then he continues it. And so Jesus, he's not like a one and done kind of guy, kind of like NCAA Division I basketball. Like he continues on. And because he reflects the Father, this is who God is too. God is not a one and done kind of God, but he continues to work. And so I think that's what you learn here about who Jesus is under this theme, that Jesus isn't just interested in simply saving you, but continuing the work in you. So there's one more theme here, and it's the talk theme, and it has less to do about who Jesus is, but really what happens when he does a work in you. And this is a theme that's throughout Matthew. And so anytime people see Jesus clearly, it actually creates a joy that's hard to contain. You notice that every time someone is healed, they just start talking? Like, what do you do when you experience something? You start what? Talking. You start telling people. And so in verse 26, after the ruler's daughter was raised from the dead, it says, and the report of this went out through all the district. I don't know how fast that was or how it worked, but all we know is after this, people were spreading the news like wildfire or fire. But they aren't just talking about anything. They're not just talking about, hey, this girl's living. They're talking about, hey, there's this man who raised this girl from the dead, and his name is Jesus. They're talking about him. After healing the blind man, this is what Jesus says, right? And this is where you see the joy that you can't stop. In verse 30, it says, and their eyes were open, and Jesus sternly warned them. He's like, hey, don't say anything. See that no one knows about it. But they went away and they spread his fame throughout all the district. And so the work of Jesus leads to the spread of who he is, right? When he's working in your life, you begin to tell people about what's going on. That's part of the plan of the kingdom to bring witness to who he is, right? And you'll notice that the more and more Jesus goes on, the more and more Jesus moves from town to town, Jesus' fame spreads like crazy. And people begin to wonder who he is. But some people, they don't actually see Jesus clearly, right? And what happens if you don't see Jesus clearly? Well, here the Pharisees are an example. They misunderstand Jesus. And so remember how I said how you view Jesus determines how you approach him, right? The Pharisees don't see Jesus clearly. They're blind, like the blind men are, to who he is. And because of that, they don't see him clearly, and they're hostile to him. Right? Their major hostility isn't just simply because they disagree with what Jesus is doing. They don't understand who he is. Because if they would have understood truly if he was the Son of God, maybe they wouldn't have killed him. So look at verse 33 and 34. It says this: and when the demon when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke, and the crowds marveled, saying, never was anything like this seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he cast out demons by the prince of demons. They totally misunderstand Jesus, and they basically call him like another one of Satan's demons. Royally missed a mark. So in verse 34, Matthew's really foreshadowing something that you've got to keep in mind. That the closer, like Jesus right now, you don't really know this unless you're paying attention to it, right? But throughout Matthew, Jesus is going from far out from Jerusalem and closer to Jerusalem. And the closer he gets to Jerusalem, the more they want to kill him. The closer he gets to Jerusalem, the more hostility he feels. And it's because they're blind to Jesus and he doesn't meet their expectations. And so one thing Matthew wants his readers to reflect on, right? We're not the first readers. We're like umpteenth readers, right? But the first century readers, the one thing Matthew wanted them to reflect on is who Jesus is. That's the same thing for us. Who is Jesus? And the reason why he's making them reflect on that question is because just as the blind men say in verse 27, he's the son of David. What does that mean? And so a long time ago, when King David was around, God promised David that he would have a son who would be just like him, a man after God's own heart. You could totally see from Matthew that Jesus kind of looks a lot like David, but he's a greater David. He's a man after God's own heart. And God made a promise to David that his son would be like as if he was God's son, right? And here you have Jesus, the Son of God. This is who Jesus is. And his son, what his son would do, he would come and reestablish God's kingdom in people's hearts. And so as Jesus is healing people, he's showing them this is what God's rule and reign looks like when it masters your heart. He would be the king who heals and restores people to the Father. And so now Jesus tells these men not to say anything. And the question you should ask is why? Why doesn't he want them to say anything? These blind men, they call Jesus the son of David. And what's really funny about that is they're blind. I mean, how are they supposed to know what Jesus looks like, right? He hasn't healed them yet, but they come out to him, son of David. Here's the thing. Jesus is meeting an expectation that this is what the Messiah would come do. He would come and bring restoration. But there's a little slip up here. See, Jesus is acting like the Messianic king, but what they thought the Messianic king was going to do is he was going to come bring retribution. That's what they expected Jesus to come do, at least the Messianic king, right? But they don't see him. All they know is that people are being healed. People are being restored. But the one thing Jesus didn't come to do in his first coming was retribution. No, he came to die for his enemies. He brought retribution on himself in order that they might have life. And he shows that on the cross. And so part of Jesus' ministry is to clarify for people who the Messiah is. He's to clarify for you, who is God? What is he really like? That's Jesus' purpose here in his first coming. And so the question for us is, do we see Jesus clearly? Do you? Do I? Do we see Jesus clearly? And I think you really have to be careful when you ask that question, or even how you answer it, because just like the Jews during Jesus' time, we're blind. We don't see perfectly. We don't see clearly. See, and here's how you know, there are parts of you that really get excited about Jesus, about certain parts of Jesus. There are also parts of you that are like, Jesus, you're not meeting my expectation. You're not doing what I think you should do, Jesus. And the one way you can see who Jesus is through the Gospels. So part of how we believe we grow here in Restoration Hope Church is we grow in community. We grow in community when we read the Word together in community. And so we call it DNA. DNA stands for Discover, Nurture, and Act. And in DNA, we just simply ask 4 questions. And that's on purpose, right? And here are the questions. Who is God? What has he done? Because who God is shows what he's done, or what he's done shows who he is. And then you ask, who am I because of what he has done? Because what that's getting at is it's showing you that you don't get your identity from what you do or who you are or what you read or what you achieve. You get your identity from who God is and what he has achieved, what he has done. And how do I respond, or what do I do because of who I am now? Because if this is what God has done and this is who I am now, man, what does that mean about how I live? How does that change about what I've thought about how I live? And really, how you see, or how do we clearly see the answers to these questions? Well, you got to look at it through the lens of the gospel. Because what the Bible has done, or what God has done through the Bible, is he climaxes the story in the gospel. Like that's the climax. That everything in the Bible is going towards the gospel on purpose. God is using human authors to write the scriptures to reveal who he is, and he clearly reveals himself in the gospel. Because everything that's been happening in the Old Testament is like a massive lob to an awesome dunk. And the gospel is like a slam dunk. It's been setting you up for this amazing thing that is the gospel. And so the Bible climaxes with the gospel because it's the only thing. The gospel, if you notice, it's the only thing that melts your heart enough for you to see who Jesus is. Because your heart, because of sin in your heart, it's kind of like ice. And if you've ever been in an icicle, I haven't, but I've seen movies, so I'm guessing this is what it's like. But if you try to look through ice, it's really blurry and unclear. And sin, it just makes your heart cold and it makes it hard to see. But the gospel is the only thing that's able to melt your heart enough for you to see Jesus. And when you see Jesus, the blood starts flowing. And you only see Jesus clear enough when you see his face, when you see what he's done. And so these questions, yes, there's a little bit of methodology in it, right? But it helps get to the heart about who God is. And if you let them, it helps you see Jesus clearly. And there's nothing magic about these, but the reason why I throw out these questions is because I think so often when we read the scriptures, like we kind of get sidetracked pretty easily. Like we start focusing on the wrong thing. And when you focus on the thing that God himself is focusing on, you begin to see him clearly. And so instead of thinking the Bible is about us and answering our questions about who we are first, it answers the question, who is God? And then it begins to make all this sense. And so only until we see Jesus clearly will we run to him. And you just got to think, am I running to Jesus? Why not? I'm guessing part of the reason is because you don't see him for who he is. And maybe you're like, well, yeah, I know what's true. I know who Jesus is. But then let's get at the unbelief. Do you really believe that's who he is? Practically, functionally, in your life, is that who you believe Jesus is? It's one thing to agree, say, yeah, I know what this is. It's one thing to really live it like you believe it. And so only when you see Jesus clearly will you run to him with faith. Only when you see him clearly will you run like the blind man saying, hey, have mercy on me, Jesus. Would you save me? Only until you see Jesus will you realize that he touches your uncleanness and gives you his cleanness. Only when you see Jesus clearly will you do that. So some questions I want you to ask yourself this week, and just really two. Again, I'll put these on Facebook, or they'll also be sliding through during the Lord's Supper. Here's the first one. If I'm honest, who do I really think Jesus is? If I'm honest. Not like what I'm supposed to believe because of what I've learned. What do I really believe? And what do I think he's doing in my life? What do I actually think he's doing in my life? Second question. When I think about the gospel, what does it reveal about who Jesus really is and what he is actually doing in my life? First question is just trying to get at, like, what am I really thinking here? The second is, what's true? Well, Jesus, thank you so much for revealing who you are. And I know in my life, the more I read the scriptures and I think about how this points me towards the gospel, or how the gospel makes it clear, I begin to see who you are clearly. And that more and more begins to transform the way I think about myself. And the way I think about who you are, it deepens my trust in you, because I begin to recognize, Lord, that you're for me and not against me, or you're present rather than absent, or that you're consistent rather than inconsistent, that you care rather than not care, that you are working rather than not working. And so, Lord, I just pray that we're not going to ace this just because we just see from these passages that Jesus shows who he is. We're not going to all of a sudden just 100% change now because we've heard a sermon on seeing Jesus clearly. But the norm has been throughout history that little by little, the calluses, the calluses begin to be chipped from our eyes. Little by little, you begin to chip off the ice that is sin off of our hearts. And I pray that this sermon would have helped just to chip it off just a little bit more, Lord, that just a little bit more we see you a little bit more clearly, so much that we would be like the blind men crying out to you, Son of David, have mercy on us. Lord, would you let that be our cry? In your name I pray. Amen.